I'm Chris Farrell, and this is On Watch. Welcome to On Watch, everybody, the Judicial Watch podcast, where we go behind the headlines and delve deep into stories that really receive less coverage than they should from the mainstream media. We like to recover lost history and explain the inexplicable. We like to have a great opportunity, like we do today, to talk to Ms. Tara Lee Rodas, who you may recall about a couple of months ago in late April testified before the House Judiciary Subcommittee on Immigration, Integrity, Security, and Enforcement. And she very bravely told some shocking, horrifying stories of her experiences concerning the exploitation of unaccompanied alien children. So before we go any further, I'd like to also remind you to, whether you're watching us on YouTube or whether you're watching listen to this podcast on Spotify or one of the other platforms out there, please be sure to subscribe, leave us a rating, leave us a comment. We love to hear from you. We want to know what you think about our podcast and what we're doing, how we try to get a hold of people and really do in-depth interviews to help inform you about the operations of government, so you understand Judicial Watch's work and how we're trying to get information out to the public. That's what we're shooting for. So along those lines, we are very pleased today to be joined by Tara Lee Rodas, who has come forward. She's blown the whistle. She's observed stuff very, very disturbing concerning unaccompanied children coming across the border. And so let's please welcome Tara to the show. Welcome.
Chris, thank you so much for having me on and for shining a light on what we now know is government-sponsored, taxpayer-funded child trafficking. You've got some horrific examples and stories to tell. We're going to get to them. I think, as we were discussing just briefly before we started the show, everything that you're talking about has been highlighted and compounded by the recent release of the movie Sound of Freedom, where the other part of this child trafficking exploitation story occurs and really kind of brings it to the point where you experienced what was going on. And this is an important part of the whole, to get the full view of what's going on. Your story is absolutely critical. So if you would, I'm going to let you kind of wind us up and get the intro, lay the background for folks. What was it that put you in a position where you had to blow the whistle about what's going on with unaccompanied children at the border? Sure. So, Chris, if you can imagine, when I deployed for this mission, volunteered to help the administration with the border crisis, specifically to help place unaccompanied children with sponsors here in the United States. Now, when I saw the advertisement and the call that went out to all agency, all federal employees, it said that this was a family reunification program. So my husband is from El Salvador. I'm a Spanish speaker. And I thought, wow, most of the children are coming from Central America. And I thought that I could help. And so I really wanted to help. What I believed was to place children in loving homes. And that's very quickly what I discovered was not the case at all. And you go into this with the very best of intentions. Oh, yes.
And you're a federal employee. You have a background professionally in the Inspector General world, but you're coming at this as a volunteer to go into a program, and it's the most vulnerable, right? Little ones.
Yes.
And that's who you're trying to help. You get on the ground. Where did you go? Where was your assignment?
So my assignment was the Pomona Fairplex Emergency Intake Site in Pomona, California. And so I was there, and in the beginning, I got to just sit and chat with the kids in their pods and color and do puzzles and walk them to their medical appointments and escort them to lunch and take them to see their case manager. And it was a very short time on site when they put out an urgent call that they need people in case management. So case management is actually where the children are processed and then delivered to the sponsor. So I thought, wow, case management, that's a great place where I could work because, thinking about efficiencies in a program, they were saying we want to reunite the kids quickly. And I thought, well, with my background, I can help find efficiencies and move the children faster to be with their family.
And you have Spanish language ability as well.
Yes. Mi español no es perfecto, pero yo puedo hablar. Yes. Yeah.
Well, it's a big step up, and it's helpful, particularly in this transition for these kids, right? They've got to have, like I said, the most vulnerable. So case management, which sounds like a great place to be, you get involved in case management, what happens?
So what happens is the case manager will get a file, and the child will come in and they will talk to the child and then talk to the sponsor. And the hope and the thought was that, the child and the sponsor know each other and you figure out what their relationship is. And then you document all of that and then actually purchase flights or bus tickets to actually send the child to the sponsor. And quickly, we discovered that children did not know who they were going to, and that the sponsors their stories were not matching what the child was saying. And this was horrifying. This is like 2 weeks in case management, and I have case managers in crisis and children in crisis. I'm seeing children crying and in panic. We had a child early on who had to be put on suicide watch. I've heard children screaming for their parents. I've had to sit with case managers that they cried to tell me the horrific stories of what's happened to the children just on the journey here. We had a little boy. Go ahead.
Pardon my interruption, because I want to make this super clear for our viewers and our listeners. These kids are unaccompanied, and their range in age from really little ones.
Oh, yeah.
Up to teenagers is what we're talking about, essentially.
Yes.
And they are literally unaccompanied. They've been shuttled north by human traffickers who are getting them into the United States one way or another. And they come into custody, and they're in this center, and they've got a story that they're offering, saying, my uncle is going to take care of me, and he lives in Seattle or wherever. And sponsors are contacting your center saying that they're supposedly the uncle from Seattle. Is this how it's supposed to work?
Yeah, well, we are actually taking the information that the children give. So whatever information they've come to the border with is the information that we use to contact the sponsor. So the sponsor doesn't even have to contact us. We're contacting them and saying, hey, we have this child. And they're like, oh, yeah, that's mine. And so that's how the process works. And the goal, if you can imagine, is to move these children in 10 to 14 days. So our site in less than 6 months processed 8,300 and a few children. So over 8,300 children in less than 6 months. Now, how much vetting of sponsors can go on when you're moving children that fast, that quickly?
Zero. I mean, that's the answer. The answer is zero. There's no vetting whatsoever.
Yeah, and they're sending documents by WhatsApp, so they could send literally photographs of documents. And the thing that is most concerning, which also the person who represented ORR at the hearing, Mr. Carey, he admitted no one working in HHS on this program, on our site or around the sites, is law enforcement. They're not investigators, so they're not 1811s or 1810s. They're not fraud examiners.
Let's pause. Let me pause for a second for our viewers and listeners. You said ORR.
Oh,
so
office.
not everybody. Not everybody knows what
yes.
that is. So explain what ORR is and who they belong to.
Okay, so ORR is Office of Refugee Resettlement. And this program, the Unaccompanied Children Program, or the UC program, is one of many programs that Office of Refugee Resettlement has responsibility for. And
they belong to
HHS.
Right.
Yes.
You might think it would belong to immigration or customs or it would belong to Border Patrol. No, it belongs to Health and Human Services.
Yes.
And so Health and Human Services has a responsibility for these children. And like I said, some are very sophisticated 16-year-olds, but others are really little ones, 4 and 5 and 6-year-old.
Oh, and 2, yeah. They have months old who come across the border. Not at our site. I think the youngest one we had at our site was 4, but we have, we had older children at our site.
Right. So, but there are cases of real little ones that are
definitely
this is precious cargo and
toddlers. Yes.
So the idea that they're being subjected to this is nightmarish. But nonetheless, ORR, part of Health and Human Services, is supposedly managing this process.
Yes.
And the people that are the managerial, the supervisory staff, there's no law enforcement. There's nobody with an investigative background. There's nobody who can vet people or act as a liaison with other agencies to make sure that the people who are representing themselves as sponsors are legit, are the actual people that they say they are. This is all This is all based on a handshake promise of, yeah, I'm the right person.
Yeah, and what is absolutely stunning is that humanitarian parole that we're doing right now for adults, one requirement is that the sponsor of an adult must be either a U.S. citizen or a permanent resident. There is no requirement to be legal to sponsor a child. Over 90% of sponsors have no legal presence.
This is insanity. This is pure insanity.
So let that sink in. Then, for humanitarian parole for an adult, so today, if someone is trying to be a sponsor for an adult, they have to prove they have the financial means to care for the adult. There is no requirement for financial means to care for an unaccompanied child. Let that sink in. That makes no sense whatsoever.
So are these sponsors who are getting these kids, are they paid a subsidy or a fee, or does the government in some way, in other words, this is a nightmare scenario, but let's say you got some real dirtball sponsor who says, look, I get X number of dollars a head. Yeah, I'll take 15 kids.
Okay.
Does that happen?
Okay. So that's exactly how it's happening, but the government is paying the flight for this trafficker or this criminal element or member of transnational criminal organizations. So remember, the thing that alerted me that we had high-level criminal actors involved in this was late August when I saw the DHS whistleblower, American hero, Aaron Stevenson, come forward and say, look, I have evidence of MS-13, 18th Street Gang, Russian Balkan crime syndicates sponsoring the children. And I'm sitting on the Pomona Fairplex knowing I've already put forward all these suspected trafficking cases. Starting in June was the very first one. I reported hotspots where we had apartment buildings with 20 children, 40 children. I reported places where we had over 300 children in a 3 square mile. That doesn't pass the common sense test. I saw sponsors who were sponsoring at different addresses. So they're trying to get kids from multiple sites. We had one sponsor, this was just stunning to me. He was trying to get one child from our site and then 3 children from the Pecos emergency intake site in Texas. So I've seen sponsors trying to simultaneously sponsor 4 children at once. And I've seen apartment buildings or an apartment, one apartment in an apartment building where you had multiple sponsors who had sponsored multiple kids. This just did not pass the common sense test. So I had been putting forward all of these cases, interestingly, reporting to HHS, Office of Inspector General, reporting to Homeland Security Investigations. And I'd like to give a shout out to a lot of really great agents and people who were working the cases. And this, of course, was going up through the chain of command at HHS. But when I saw Aaron Stevenson's disclosure that there were members of transnational criminal organizations getting the kids, I quickly circulated that around the site. And it took us less than 2 weeks to find the first case of a confirmed MS-13 affiliated sponsor. And this sponsor was simultaneously sponsoring 2 children, one from our site and one from the Fort Bliss emergency intake site. And I thought, honestly, this is unbelievable that we have now criminal networks here because, see, back to your question about the money part, when they now understand that the United States government is paying the ticket to get the child, unlike your average person, unlike you, Chris, unlike me, and many other people who volunteered to help what they thought was family reunification, we view children as precious, and the children who are vulnerable, who should be guarded and cared for. These traffickers view children as assets. They are commodities.
Exactly.
So when they find out that the United States government is going to put them on a plane and in the middle of the night without telling anyone, without telling state attorney generals, without telling state legislators or anybody, we're going to be sending kids and paying the airfare to deliver the child the last mile. They are collecting income earning assets. They view the children as assets, and they are collecting these assets to earn income through labor trafficking, through sex trafficking, and worse.
I need to get a sense for, you're smarter than the average bear, as the old Yogi commercial cartoon used to say. So you're coming into this, and you're looking at it a much sharper, much smarter way than the average person might, and you're making these quick connections between what's clearly a racket, and you do what you're supposed to do and report this through the chain of command, and then you're also communicating laterally to other interested parties, saying, "Hey, look, this looks really fishy. There's something going on here. There's people are exploiting the system." As you begin to do this, what does the immediate level of management, 1 or 2 levels above you, what's their response? What do they say to you? Shut up and keep going? I mean, what's their commentary or their reaction to your sounding the alarm? What do they do?
Well, what is absolutely the most unbelievable and horrific thing was to hear from my direct supervisor that, Tara, we only get sued if we keep kids in care too long. We don't get sued by traffickers. Are you clear? We don't get sued by traffickers. And so that is the legal position of HHS, because they don't get sued by traffickers and they're not legally responsible. They transfer custody of a vulnerable child to a sponsor. The sponsor then has custody of the child. It is unconscionable. They know this is going on. They've known it's been going on in the system for more than a decade. That is the other thing that was horrific, is that after we started finding these suspicious sponsors, remember, I had no idea when I volunteered for the mission that one child had ever been trafficked through the program. So it's after we're finding all these suspicious sponsors that one of the people on my team, who was another federal volunteer, she actually found the Senate hearings from 2016, which detailed how traffickers used the system in 2014 to bring these vulnerable children from Guatemala to work in slave labor conditions under the threat of themselves and their families on an egg farm in Marion, Ohio. Then Senator Rob Portman held hearings in 2016. You can read their whole report. And I'm sitting there reading through this report going, they know.
And it's clear that they
horrible.
knew for 6, 7, 8 years. They knew. I mean,
Yes.
documented. They knew.
Yes.
It's-
Yeah. It was a horrible revelation. A horrible revelation to realize I was on the wrong side.
So I mean, this is really jarringly disturbing
Yes.
information. Not just the information. The information you've given is astounding, but what you just revealed, that they knew 6, 7, 8 years ago, and they had a hearing. Hooray! You had a hearing. What did you do about it? And the answer is nothing. In fact, they improved the process to move more, is what they've done. They made it even worse.
Yeah.
Now, let me ask you, on the back end of this, what you've described, we're going to do a little more detail, but what you've described happens. The child is given to somebody. I'm hoping that somewhere in the story there are some good, legit sponsors. There's got to be some. There's some legit ones. But in this case, you've got these criminal dirtballs who are sponsors. On the back end, is there any, you talked about casework and placing the children. Is there any casework on the back end? Is anybody going and checking on the children once they've been placed with a sponsor?
Well, if you're aware, right, since 2021, the United States government through HHS has taken in over 300,000 children. Today, we know they cannot make contact with over 85,000 children. A third of the children disappeared. Now, this is why I told Congress, during my testimony, I said the number one thing that you could do is require HHS to turn the data over to the Inspector General community. There are data analysts in the IG community who could quickly look at the data and see where the anomalies are and know who to go after. But see, they don't want anyone going after their sponsors. They value the anonymity of the sponsor more than they value the safety of the children.
This is some of the most sick, perverse stuff I've heard. I've been at Judicial Watch for 24 years. I've seen a lot of weird, sick, disgusting things. This is a story that is up at the top 2 or 3 ever. And the other stories, believe me, you don't even want to know about. But this is a case that when 85,000 kids fall off the radar screen, you have no idea where they are, who has custody of them, where they're living. How do these people live with themselves? How do they get up in the morning and look in the mirror and knowing what they've done? It isn't like they didn't know, they made a mistake, no one told me. They know what they're doing every single morning when they get up and go to work. So you had enough guts to blow the whistle. You had enough guts to do the right thing and inform people and say, hey, this is wrong, knock it off. But there's people that you've just described, they're fine with this. They don't care. This is what they do for a living. They send kids off to disappear.
Yeah, well, that is the problem with people who don't understand the consequence of their policy of having certain performance measures. So one of the other things I told Congress was they absolutely need to change their performance measure of speed. Why do we need to move a child in 10 to 14 days? That doesn't make any sense. Anyone who's been involved in foster care, adoption, international adoption, these processes can take a year or more. Why? Because they're making sure that the home where the child is going is safe. They're making sure that the people are really who they say they are.
Right.
So 10 to 14 days. In the same time period, what's been very strange is, interestingly, international adoptions have dropped. Well, I wonder why, when anybody can just get a kid in 10 to 14 days. It just doesn't make sense. And so the other thing is that when there is a culture of fear, everyone was scared that even when we reported the first case in June, we didn't say it was trafficking because we didn't know how rampant trafficking was in the system. We called it suspicious sponsor. And people were like, if we turn this in, we could get sent home. We could get fired. The case managers, one of my case managers ended up in the hospital for stress. So people were scared that they were going to be retaliated against. And I said, here's what's going to happen. I said, the day I get walked, I'm going to keep speaking the truth. I said, and you'll know that the day that I get walked off the site, it's because of child trafficking. And I was not going to shut up, but HHS was retaliating against a lot of people. They moved people out of jobs. Someone at HHS leaked Secretary Becerra, stating that if Ford was alive today, he wouldn't be happy with the speed of this company. And so saying things like that the people moving the children had fears. The MVM, the transportation company, remember we were hearing about all those midnight flights in the cover of darkness. Right. Yeah, well, MVM, they had a whistleblower come forward. MVM was the transportation company, and they had a whistleblower come forward saying the kids often said that they didn't know who they were going to. And so this, there were so many people along the way who were trying to tell the truth, but their goal was to silence and censor. So when it took me just 4 months of speaking out for them to say, okay, we can no longer have Tara Rodas looking at cases. We have got to get her off this site. Now, fortunately, because I knew the severity of these types of allegations and the horrible peril and crisis that we were putting children in, I was fortunate enough that I had gone outside of chain of command and had been started reporting outside chain of command. So even though I was reporting up chain of command, I also started going outside chain of command because I knew that the day I got walked off the site, it was going to be because of child trafficking. And that's exactly what happened. The MS-13 case was just too much. Once I figured out we had high-level criminal operators, I started trying to get as much information from the kids about, tell me about your journey, who was involved. And so this, interestingly, for those of your listeners who saw or are going to see Sound of Freedom, what was stunning for me to learn is that women are often involved. And in the case of Sound of Freedom, they took down Miss Cartagena because she was the one who was getting the children. So my MS-13 operator in Ohio was a female. The coyote, or the smuggler who brought the children, 22 children were brought. She was female and was going to be going also to Ohio. I got my case manager because we were not supposed to ask who else is in the household. I said, we need to get every bit of information that we can. I said, sure. So just ask her if by some chance something happens with her status, who could take care of the kids? So she sends us the ID of a household member who just happens to be from Sinaloa. Now, I can't say that maybe there's nothing wrong there. Maybe our MS-13 actor, maybe she's a great person. Maybe the person, her household member from Sinaloa, has absolutely no contact with, gangs or cartels. Maybe, but maybe not. But see,
figure the odds,
my job
right?
is to report the facts.
Right. So I'm going to ask you a question you may not like to answer, but I have to ask it because it's built into me. Who are the U.S. government officials most responsible for this? Who's sitting at the Pomona Fairplex who somebody should walk over to with a microphone and a camera and stick it in their face and ask them why they're trafficking children?
Well, first, I think we should start with Secretary Becerra, because he was in charge of all the emergency intake sites, and he's ultimately the one responsible for HHS and a program that he has lost control of. So we should be clear. HHS has lost control of the UC program. Period. End of story. That's Secretary
Who's the head of
Becerra.
ORR? So Secretary Becerra, I get that, but who's the ORR head?
Okay, I forget her name. She recently testified and could give no response to where are the 85,000 children. And I cannot remember her name off the top of my head. But yes, she would also be responsible, obviously.
I mean, there's a person who must have what I refer to as guilty knowledge. Either they should have known, they're either complicit or they're negligent. One or the other. Either they know what's going on and they're in the middle of it and they just don't give a damn, or they're so out to lunch, they're so disconnected, all they're doing is showing up and having a latte in the morning and then taking off the afternoon, and they're completely uninvolved and they're negligent. But it's one or the other, because you can't have it both ways.
Exactly. And when we're talking about vulnerable children, okay, the New York Times is reporting. I have to give a shout out to Hannah Dreier at the New York Times. She has interviewed the children. She has shared the plight of the children who have been killed here in their first months of being in the United States because they're not qualified to do their jobs. She has talked about middle schoolers working in slaughterhouses all across the country. She wrote a damning expose called Alone and Exploited. And she wrote another one that said that the administration ignored all warnings. Now, all of this has come to light, and yet nothing still has been done. And
this is what makes me nuts, right? This is what makes me nuts right there. Mm-hmm. You've gone through and laid this all out for a committee of the House. There's been testimony, frankly, 6-7 years ago, essentially saying the same thing, but now it's even worse. The ORR chief, we'll figure out what her name is, and we'll do a follow-up with that. She testifies. Becerra's sending out vague threats to the staff to hurry up and move kids. There's the whistleblower that came forward from DHS. Mm-hmm. There's stories being told in pieces consistently. And, I mean, as shocking as it is, no one really seems to give a damn. I mean, there's no march in front of the Capitol. There's no protests. There's nobody painting mottos on streets in the United States. The people that are supposed to be so compassionate and caring for letting undocumented migrants or illegal aliens, all the people that are supposed to be bleeding hearts for compassion, you don't hear a peep out of these phonies. Not a word.
No. And that is what is stunning to me, is that you have people, Aaron Stevenson, the DHS whistleblower, was fired for coming forward with his disclosure. But his disclosure led to me uncovering the exact same thing, which led to me reporting it being walked off the site, okay, with security and the federal field specialist telling me I'm going to be investigated, and they took my badge. My agency they were so concerned for my safety, and I didn't think that anybody would do anything to me on the site, but I mean, you never know, right? They were going to send armed agents to escort me back to DC. Now, my husband escorted me back to DC. But I can't believe this is not front page news. I thought for sure, especially after Project Veritas and James O'Keefe went knocking on doors and showed the children telling their stories of being pimped out by their sponsors, or having to quit school to pay their debt to the cartel, or the little girl who was like 4 or 5, and she is living in a 1-room apartment with 4 other men. And this is what they found as they were knocking on all these doors: a small child with all these adult men. And yet nothing is done. It defies belief that every single newspaper and every single media outlet is not demanding to know, where are the children? Where are the children? This is very concerning that, where is the heart of America? This is not a Democrat issue or a Republican issue. This is a humanitarian issue. If we are going to try to stand up and say, hey, we are the torch of freedom, send everybody here. Well, what happens to them when they get here? It's slave labor, sex trafficking, labor trafficking, worse. The smugglers in El Salvador told some pretty terrible tales. So this
I'm used to all the usual corruption of Washington, D.C., sort of the Hunter Biden flavor of, deals and drugs and sex and all the other kind of, that's the run-of-the-mill Washington, D.C. sort of, staple diet. But what you're talking about is on a completely different level.
Yes.
These are kids. These are kids who never did a thing to anybody ever. And you can question the sanity or the judgment of whatever adults sent them north, because you're sending them into the clutches of real criminal animals. So they may think, oh, we're going to send the little one north because he'll have a better life, whatever. They're sending them on a one-way trip to hell is what they're doing.
Yes,
and then the animals on this end who are waiting to get them in their clutches. And in the middle, as you've pointed out perfectly, is a vast, elaborate federal government process, an engine that is churning along, doing placement.
Yes.
They're taking these kids and putting them in the hands. Not every single one of them is a criminal. I'm not trying to overstate it. Right. But to the point where 85,000 disappear.
Yeah.
So let me just you go ahead. I want to hear you.
Yeah.
I want to hear your
So
point.
I was just going to say, people need to rethink. One, they should see Sound of Freedom to see how this happens, but they should really rethink what compassion looks like, because let's just take, most of the children are coming to us from Guatemala. Some of the children who I saw with my own eyes and sat in as the case manager interviewed with an interpreter, because some of these children cannot even speak Spanish.
Right,
they're
got
living
their own
in
dialect.
remote, they're speaking Mayan dialects, Quiche and Mam and other things. So they can't speak Spanish. They can't ask for help in Spanish. They can't ask for help in English. Some of these children have never been to school. They can't read. They can't write. They are a victim population. They were fine in Guatemala working on the farm with their family. Everybody should go to YouTube and put in "trafficked in America," and they will see exactly how that Marion Egg Farm case happened, how they lured the children, how the trafficker had them working in these slave labor conditions. It's going on, and it's worse today. These children were not raped in their hometowns, but when they started this journey, the stories are absolutely beyond belief of the things that I've heard. Like, I couldn't even imagine that somebody would do this to a small child. We had a little boy from Guatemala who was only 8, and I sat across with the case manager as she cried to tell me, she says, "Tara, What kind of a person could do this? The child who I am working with right now, he's only 8, and he's in diapers because he's been raped so much. And I'm trying to, right now it makes the hair stand up on my arm. We do not understand the level of evil that some people possess. You know, they do not care about these children. The US government, we better care about the children. And this is absolutely unacceptable. It's unacceptable that billions of taxpayer dollars, billions, anyone can go on to the HHS website, so usaspending.gov. So I recommend everybody do this. Follow the money, usaspending.gov. HHS is a $2.8 trillion agency with a T, trillion. They have put billions of dollars into the unaccompanied children program, which is the middleman, which is the airline, the delivery system for this program, taking children in and flying them out to unvetted sponsors and losing them. This is absolutely unacceptable, but your tax dollars and my tax dollars are paying to put children in modern day slavery. America is better than that. We must stand up and we must say, this must stop. This must stop.
You very bravely and in a very compelling, articulate way provided testimony back at the end of April 26th. You were in front of the House Judiciary Subcommittee. 2 questions. Number one, how did you get there? How did you end up in front of the committee? Let's do that one first. What was the path? You get walked off the job site for telling the truth. They have to shut you up. But thankfully, you had already started your efforts.
Right.
But then
right.
how do you go from there to in front of the committee?
Right. So after that, it was a lot of, I sat down with agents. I gave recorded testimony. I told about a lot of the things that I had witnessed. I was able to talk to attorney generals of various states, people who were trying to make a difference. And when I wasn't, everybody was doing everything within their power that they could, right? The challenge is there must be awareness amongst the American people. If people don't know what's happening, then they can't stand up and say, hey, we need to stop this. So when I didn't start seeing front page news like 25 children rescued from sex trafficking operation in Houston, when I wasn't seeing headlines like that quickly, that's when I decided to go to Project Veritas, right? And once Project Veritas's story went out and they realized, that I actually had been sitting on the site, that I had been processing the cases, that I had reported through every chain of command, and that because of my reporting through every chain of command, I was swiftly and strongly retaliated against under threat of investigation. That's what caught the attention of some people on Capitol Hill. So that's when some of the congressmen actually wrote a letter to Becerra to ask him to answer these allegations. None of that ever happened. But people were starting to work behind the scenes to say, wait a minute, is this really happening? Did they really strip out all of the background checks? Have they really put in all this field guidance? And when they realized that they had, somebody reached out to me from House Judiciary and said, would you be willing to testify to what you saw? And of course, speaking the truth and shining a light on government-sponsored, taxpayer-funded child trafficking is important. And I'm very honored that I had the privilege to speak the truth, because it's the only way that people are going to be able to fix this problem.
Well, thank God for you, Tara. Let me tell you, I mean that from the bottom of my heart. Thank God for you. You're a brave and good woman, and you did the right thing, and you faced a lot of creeps and a lot of selfish, self-centered, cowardly bureaucrats, and you stood up to them, and you did the right thing, You did the honorable, good thing to protect these kids and to do the very best you could. So,
Yeah. Well,
well
Chris,
done.
before you put me too
these
high
are
on
just,
a pedestal.
These are just facts based on what your testimony is. I mean,
yeah. Well.
Here's the unpleasant part of the question. This is part two. So who's going to do something about this?
Well, that is a question that we should be asking every federal representative, that we should be asking our state representatives too, because how is it that the federal government is bypassing all state like knowledge checks and awareness? So for example, when I was on the Pomona Fairplex, as we were sending children all over the United States to all different states, why were not all of the names of the sponsors given so that the sponsors had to report in, so that the sponsors put the children in school, right? All of these things, these could be checks and balances in the system because the sponsor's being held accountable. So there are things that need to be done. Now, if I had my way, HHS would not release one more child, period, stop, until they can figure out a system. And it probably shouldn't even be under Health and Human Services because they don't have investigators. They don't have people who know about fraud. We need people who can vet these sponsors and have a sane system.
People that would call up. I mean, look, the case manager could call up a county sheriff and say, hey, we're thinking about placing a kid with so-and-so, and have the local county sheriff run a quick criminal check, and they could come back and tell you more. Then it doesn't have to be very sophisticated. I mean, basic checks, just to have some sense of, if you call the county sheriff's office and the person that you're checking on is known to the police, guess what? That's a disqualifier. Surprise, surprise.
You would think.
This is not very sophisticated stuff. And the fact that there's no effort being done to do this.
Well, it's very sad because another thing I've learned is I'm not the only whistleblower who's come forward over the years. There was another brave whistleblower who used to work for Homeland Security Investigations back in 2015. He came forward to Senator Grassley and said, look, because he worked as part of the human smuggling cell. His name is Jason Piccolo. And he said his life changed when he realized that we were giving kids to criminals. And he wrote a book about it. Because we're not requiring that the individuals who are the sponsors to have legal presence, and because they're not accountable to anyone, and HHS is not requiring them to report into anyone, there's no case manager who could call a sheriff and say, hey, tell me about so-and-so. Because so-and-so doesn't exist in any system. They're not even here legally.
Right.
So over 90% of the sponsors. So there is no way to do proper vetting.
There's no check that could ever be done.
Exactly. So that doesn't make sense when we should hold the sponsor accountable. There's no right. Sorry, the Bill of Rights does not say you have the right to come into the United States illegally and then be the sponsor of unaccompanied children. No. There is no right to be a sponsor. There's no right. And so why we're acting as if there is and putting vulnerable children in harm's way is astounding. And it was a terrible revelation. That's all I can say. It was a terrible revelation to realize they knew. They knew that children were trafficked through the program.
I want to do two things. I want to get your input on where our viewers and listeners can get more information. I want them to be informed and educated. And then secondly, I want to know what your recommendation is on a call to action. Anybody who's heard this or viewed this anybody who then goes out and sees Sound of Freedom or is interested in the plight of human trafficking and the exploitation of children in particular, there's got to be a call to action where people can do something. So those two things, if you could give us an idea on education and information, and then call to action, what do you recommend?
Okay, so for education and information, the beginning is understanding that it exists and awareness. So that's why I say Sound of Freedom is very powerful, because it shows you exactly how it happens. Nobody would say that drug trafficking is a conspiracy, but when you don't understand how it happens, people can start to think, well, I can't imagine how it could happen, therefore it must not be true. So that's why I think seeing the Sound of Freedom and seeing exactly how people manipulate both children and parents, then they can see how the trafficking occurs. So that's number one, is awareness. Make sure that you're aware, and then tell your friends, right? Tell all your friends. I've told everyone, I've taken people to see the movie. I'm like, you have to see the movie. You have to understand how it works, because this is a real live case. I'm sure a lot of your viewers probably saw the movie Taken with Liam Neeson.
Right.
What's so interesting is that movie, everybody loved the movie. All the press about the movie was fantastic and positive, because people know that sex trafficking of children happens. But Liam Neeson's movie was fantasy. That wasn't real children. Now, those were stories that I'm sure could have happened like that. But Sound of Freedom, these are real children that this happened to. So awareness. Then the next thing I would say is figure out in your local community who's involved with anti-sex trafficking things. So America's Future trains people on things that you can look for. There are organizations like Operation Underground Railroad, A21, which is Christine Caines. She has a global organization that fights human trafficking. There's the International Justice Mission, so IJM. So people can look at various trafficking organizations to kind of get more information. So, and they will help you to identify what are some of the indicators that a child is being trafficked. If anybody has been on 10 flights in the United States, there's a very good possibility that you were on a plane with a child that was being trafficked, but you didn't know, because you didn't know what to look for. So there
That's
are
horrific.
things that if people just know what to look for, then you can raise a flag to someone. So getting that awareness, and then finding an organization that you feel fits for you, and understanding what some of the indicators are, then that will go a long way. And then as far as a call to action, I think we need to call our federal and state representatives and say, where are the children? Where are the children? Yesterday, the Washington Times, so I live in Virginia, and the Washington Times talked about how HHS has released children with tuberculosis through the Unaccompanied Children program because they don't have enough time to give them treatment. But the problem with treating the children is once they get to the state, well, how can they even follow up with them? So there are serious questions that states need to be asking, or that we can be asking our state legislators, like, hello, what's going on in the state? Where are these children? What other things do we need to be concerned about? Because these are very serious illnesses that can be passed, and we also want to care for these children who've come here. So there's some Congress and our state legislators need to be held accountable for the safety of children. Just like if there were children in your school system and there was a major problem, You could go to federal and state representatives and say, hey, what's going on? We need to do that now. 85,000 children are missing. Children are working night shifts in slaughterhouses. Children are being sold for sex. This is a crisis. We have to stand up for the kids. We must stand up for these children.
You are 100% correct. I thank you for your time, for your very compelling story, for your testimony to Congress. I'm heartened that the information becomes public and that there's increased awareness. But characters like Becerra, whoever this ORR chief is, I'll figure out what her name is, that they can walk around and look at themselves in the mirror every day, knowing that they are creating the conditions and subsidizing the activities that cause this kind of abuse of children.
Yes.
And they can't ever get away from it. I don't care how many times they apologize or say they didn't know or they weren't aware or they didn't mean it or they didn't understand the consequences. This is on them. It's on them forever. Yes. They cannot allow this kind of stuff to happen and then go off to their Washington, D.C. cocktail party or their Democratic National Committee fundraiser, soiree that these people, they literally have blood on their hands. And they can't do this to little kids. And
no.
I thank you for your time. Literally, I mean this from the bottom of my heart. God bless you and all that you've done. And before I close, I'll just give you the last word to wrap us up here.
Sure. Chris, I just want to really thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to share the plight of the children and to, shine a light on what we know is government-sponsored, taxpayer-funded child trafficking. And I also want to say, before anybody puts me up on a pedestal, I think it's important for people to know, I'm not ashamed to say I've cried a lot of tears. This has been a heavy weight and a burden to carry, but God is faithful, and whatever he calls us to, he gives us the power to do. And so that's, I've been carried along, and I really appreciate your kind words, but I think it's important for people to know that there were days I was scared, I was shaking, and it was a challenging road to walk, but I've seen the children, I've looked into their faces. And so I know that one voice can make a difference. And so together, I do believe that we can move the needle on this. I think we can make a difference. And if we act now, we can save lives. So I'm calling on your listeners to take action, and let's go save these kids.
Tara Lee Rodas, thank you very much for your time and for your very compelling and important story about this outrageous abuse of children at the hands of the United States government. We appreciate all of your efforts, and hopefully we'll be back in touch again with better news on this front sometime in the future.
Definitely.
I'm Chris Farrell, on Watch.